College football nerds here talking Georgia and Notre Dame in round two of the playoffs. And this one is going to be interesting given the unknowns that we will have to discuss. And Josh is here with me. Let's just talk about it from the jump. I'm sure that is unoriginal, but we're going to do it. Gunnar Stockton taking the helm at QB for Georgia throughout the playoffs, given the elbow injury to Carson Beck. And, you know, Georgia fans can appreciate this maybe to their detriment or sadness that it's one thing to face a backup quarterback in a high stakes game as a curveball because they come in the middle of the game versus being able to prepare for that quarterback over a lot of time and then face them as the backup that's now starting. Those are two totally different things. And I think in that sense, there's probably some concern if you're a Georgia fan that the shock is not going to be there, and what we're going to see is someone who's not very experienced, and that inexperience is going to show.
It is so hard for us sitting here to guess what Gunnar Stockton's going to look like, because in that game in the SEC Championship where he came in, he looked like a player who was the backup quarterback and wasn't expecting to play, trying to grind out a win. I mean, I give him a lot of credit for being a gutsy guy, but he did a lot more with his legs than he did with his arm. Threw an interception that darn near lost Georgia the game. 4.4 yards per attempt is pretty horrendous. Didn't complete a pass over 10 yards or didn't throw a pass over 10 yards. Um, I don't think that's who Gunnar Stockton is. All around, good and bad. I don't think that's necessarily what his game is. I think that's who he needed to be in the moment. Now, they've had a month to sit and work with him to get him up to speed with timing the offense. But it's a really odd situation that this is essentially his home opener for him to try to make a playoff run. Having, I looked at this earlier. I mean, he's barely played, right? I mean, I tried to find his stats. Daniel, there's only one game where he threw more than 4 passes the whole season. That was he threw 12 against Tennessee Tech. And that's an FCS team, so there was nothing to really be gleaned when you watch it. There's just guys wide open. He still was only 7.5 yards per. They didn't throw downfield with him. So there's no tape on him. And I think that might be an advantage to Georgia as much as they've got something on tape. We talked about this a little bit, some of the other previews. But in this game in particular, I don't even know if there really is tape on him from that championship game. I think they're going to have a new offense. Maybe that's an advantage. Maybe it's a disadvantage. But I can't help but throw up the asterisk that no one can know. And if we want to talk about how good he is or isn't going to be, we're blowing smoke. We are, at this channel, have never been afraid of telling you when we see a team and we say, look, this is just a question mark. But it is just a question mark. And I'll say right now, the point spread for this game, Georgia by 1.5. Over under 44, very low. And this is a game expected to be something like 21-24. And what that says to me, Daniel, is this is Vegas saying, I think Vegas feels like they want to try to balance the money. I don't think they have any confidence in how to read it. I don't think we have any confidence in how to read it. I will say, in terms of receiving cores, I don't know if either one of these teams has the receivers that are going to necessarily blow your socks off. But I think what you have on both cases is you've got kind of mirror images, even though Riley Leonard is more experienced. You've got mobile quarterbacks that aren't afraid to run, aren't afraid to take a hit, but there are major question marks about their ability to throw vertically. There are major questions about their ability to operate an efficient offense against a good high-caliber defense. And they both have receiving cores that are good, but they're not Ohio State or Oregon good. And against the caliber defenses that both of them bring, and Georgia fans, if you don't know, that Notre Dame defense is legit. Even though they've had major injuries at all 3 levels, they're still a very good defense. It's going to be a tall task, I think, for any of these quarterbacks to be overly successful. But you know what? That's classic football. RPO's fallen off. We've talked about it a lot this year. Scoring has come down by benefit of the clock rules changing, by benefit of the fact that I think defenses have moved to this zone, fire zone looks where they're disguising coverage at the snap, which is making it, one, hard to throw the RPO because it's easy to make a bad decision quickly, hence why Georgia's thrown a lot of interceptions with Carson Beck. But it's also just generally kept scores lower, kept these games more competitive. And in that environment, having high-caliber defenses, I think, has become really valuable again. So this is, I think, a much more competitive game than maybe someone would have thought about a month and a half ago, for sure, especially when Notre Dame was an afterthought. But Daniel, as we've said for really weeks, we've not been super high on them through the season, but as the season went along, especially the end of the year, Notre Dame did round out the year very strong. I do think they've been a bit of an unfair afterthought. I think the defense is very good. The run game is absolutely phenomenal, which we'll get into the model in a minute. I think the question is going to be sort of evaluating that versus a caliber team that really, to be honest, just really haven't played yet this season.
I'm going to be honest. If Beck was in this game, I would pick Georgia by multiple scores. I don't know that Georgia is that much better overall as a team than Notre Dame, because I think, we talked about this in the past. In past years, Notre Dame teams have been on the elite stage without being elite teams as a product of their schedule. This year, I think they also have that same weak schedule, but they're actually deserving to be on the stage that they're on, if that makes any sense. But they have not played teams that can throw the ball. They just really haven't. On average, they've played about the 80th best passing team in the country. They've played 7 teams that are ranked 93rd or worse, 6 or 105th or worse, and then you got like 116, 115, 118, 134, 132. Like, these teams aren't throwing the ball. And so I do think that Beck coming in, for all of his faults, would be someone who could expose that defense at least early and shock them in a way that you just get shocked. And look, they've played 2 what I think are decent passing offenses, and I have an asterisk next to Indiana because I don't think they're that good of a passing offense. I think they played a bunch of teams that can't defend their scheme very well and don't have defensive lines that can slow them down. They played a really weak schedule. But the 2 teams that aren't, 75th or whatever are Louisville and USC. Both of those teams, those are the only 2 teams that got into the 20s or more. USC scored 35, into the 20s or more against Notre Dame. And it's not a coincidence in my mind. They have feasted, and this defense is tailor-made to feast against teams that are just, run heavy, run the quarterback, whatever. Having said all that, Josh, what you're going to get in Gunnar Stockton is probably not a guy that's going to throw it all around the yard. It's the opposite, and it's almost like a gift that has fallen into their lap to make this matchup a lot more palatable for Notre Dame.
Yeah, it is interesting. So when you look at their profiles, Daniel, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump to our model, at least for underlying statistics. So you can go to collegefootballnerds.com. You can look at stats for any teams, and we have this thing called relative performance or expected performance. Basically, how did you do against the teams you played versus how they did against everybody else? And it's a purely opponent-adjusted version of statistics. Nobody else has copied us yet on this, but pretty simple, right? If your opponents are allowing 4 yards per carry and you allow 3, then you're 25% better than average. And I think it's useful to do that because this game is so relative to the sport of college football. I don't think absolute stats are great. So it's just sort of an interesting way to look at it. In that regard, the profiles of these teams are, I think, very interesting. So offensively, in terms of points per game expected performance, Notre Dame is actually number 1 in the country, Daniel. They're number 2 in the country points per game, period, but adjusted for competition, 61% better than average, number 1. Total yards per game, though, they're only 20th. And this is really where you see the dichotomy offensively in terms of per attempt, right? Per attempt, per carry. 60-second passing, first rushing. This is the number 1 rush offense by a pretty considerable margin and a very average pass offense. Not at all surprising if you followed Riley Leonard. We've said for years, dating back to his time at Duke when he was a transfer, we thought Riley Leonard is a gamer. He's a tough kid. He's a great athlete. He can make plays because he's comfortable throwing on the run and creating. He is not a great drop back passer. And when you force him to throw from the pocket, that comes out that his pure arm talent, mechanics, and all are not really that high level. Defensively, I find it interesting, Daniel. They are the number 1 pass defense opponent adjusted. They're only the number 25 run defense. And, to your point, it's kind of interesting there because they haven't faced a lot of good pass defenses, which some ways can actually make it hard to stand out because it's hard to look great when everybody looks bad regardless. I do think it's notable, right, that really the best lineman on the team is out, and probably the most disruptive lineman of the team is out for Notre Dame, kind of compiling a set of injuries that have plagued them all year at every level, and it's got them pretty banged up. But when you look at Georgia, I think it's almost more interesting that because, again, Notre Dame offense and defense flipped in how it operates, but really, really good running versus not as good passing and vice versa. Georgia, what you see is the per play statistics don't end up adding up to the scoring potential and the overall production of the offenses. Somehow they're better than the sum of their parts. Only 39 in passing yards per attempt, only 47th in rush yards per carry in our opponent adjusted metrics. But they're actually the 7th best scoring offense in the country, opponent adjusted. 29th overall, but you got to take into account that their schedule is one of the absolute hardest in the country. I think if you factor in Texas, it may well be the hardest now. And the reason for that, Daniel, is they're 5th in the country in passing yards per game, 91st in rushing. They are a team that throws the ball more than they run it. 480 carries to 400, or 480 passes to 400 carries. And you kind of see a similar thing to a smaller degree defensively, 24th yard per attempt, 14th yard per carry. Again, both really taking those 43rd and 25th absolute numbers and cutting them in half due to competition. But they end up being the 15th best point per game defense, 17th best total yardage. It's better than the average of those two. And I think what that really goes to show is that Georgia has found a way to be more successful than they kind of have any right to be. When you watch them from our model's perspective, we have a 1 through 134 computer model ranking. We take every team and we simulate playing every other team in our model, and we rank them based on record. Georgia is only 15th in that ranking. Notre Dame is 3rd. But the thing with Georgia is when you start modeling them to the teams ahead of them, like Georgia is more competitive with the teams at the top than Tennessee or Alabama are in many cases due to matchups. And more than anything due to their consistency. Georgia as a football team, if you look at their scoring, they've scored somewhere between 25 to 35 points on a very consistent basis for good or ill. I mean, when they're playing Texas, they score 30 points. Score 22 the other time. Tennessee, they score 31. Florida, though, they score 34. Auburn, they score 31. Those are much inferior defenses. Florida's not a very good defense compared to the others. And I think what all that says is that Georgia has kind of developed a pro-style offense that moves the chains well. They don't have a ton of yardage per play, but as in Georgia fashion in recent years, they're efficient, so they sustain drives, and if they execute well, they can score at a pretty predictable, consistent clip. That was the mantra for Georgia with Carson Beck. Notre Dame is a little bit different. They are run first. They are a power run team. They are very good against the pass because they're very disruptive, and they've got great players in the secondary. I think Watts is an absolutely phenomenal player that probably, between him and Kaiser, those two really don't get anywhere near enough credit on the national level. But they are much more dependent on the run game first, second, and third. And Price, and let's be clear, running the ball, Love, Leonard, Price, those are phenomenal backs. But I don't know how well that scales against elite competition. And so, Daniel, I know this is a long rant, but breaking it all down, what it comes down to is Georgia is a team that is kind of who they are, or have been to this point this season, no matter who they play. They are pro-style. They have their warts. This is not the same kind of defense they've had in recent years. I don't know if it's the same kind of offense they've had in recent years, frankly. But they've been pretty consistent in the production, and they play up and down in the competition, so to speak, as a result of that. Notre Dame is a team that wants to lean on you. They want to run the ball. On average, in terms of overall statistics, performance, etc., Notre Dame on paper is a better team than Georgia by a decent clip. The problem is I don't think Notre Dame scales as well as Georgia. And so the question is, when you scale against elite competition, how much does that gap close? And does it close enough to where Georgia actually ends up being the better team on paper? And Daniel, that's an interesting question in a game that, again, has a very close point spread.
I think there's another thing that needs to be pointed out here, and that's we do this a lot because they're elite teams with elite rosters and they've played each other a lot. They're compared to each other a lot. Alabama has done a lot with their defense to stop teams like Georgia, to stop RPO spreads, to stop 2018 Clemson, if you will. And they've shown that they're very effective at that this year defensively. What they've shown that has opened them up to is teams like you just described in Notre Dame, teams that are gritty, run the ball, are willing to take their time, play that, 4 yards per play. We're just going to keep moving the chains on you sort of thing. And who are the two teams that run QB power with quarterbacks that can throw, that maybe aren't the best throwers, but are very physical teams that run the quarterback a lot? Alabama and Georgia Tech. Haynes King is Leonard. They're the same quarterback, in my opinion. What are the two games where Georgia gave up a boatload of points this year? Alabama and Georgia Tech. And so from that standpoint, I wonder if Alabama, Georgia Tech did a thing to Georgia in a way that Notre Dame can do and might give them fits. Just like Oklahoma offensively against Alabama gave them fits. Yes, they ran a veer and it was a weird offense, but it was a commitment to grinding out a game. I thought that Alabama game was an aberration until the same thing happened, in Georgia Tech. So it looks like there's something there. So I do wonder, Josh, if we've got a situation where the worst possible style of offense that Georgia wants to face, they got in Notre Dame. And the best possible style of offense that Notre Dame wants to face, they got in Georgia now with Gunnar Stockton.
I think there's probably at least an argument for it. Now, look, Georgia was a bit banged up, especially in the edges when they played Alabama. I think that had a big effect on that game. I actually think if they're healthy and they've got, you've got all the healthy pieces out there with Jalen Walker and, Mikael Williams and all those guys, I think they may win that game. It's really a quarter and a half that Alabama blew up on them, and then Georgia adjusted. But I do think there's something to the fact that Georgia has struggled a little bit, like you said, with power quarterback run, execution on the edges, and all these defenses that are now based on, it's a fire zone defense. It's what Georgia, you say Alabama adapted to it to segue into this, but I think Georgia really adapted to it first. It's the change they made under Lanning, and then they've continued. It's predominantly zone now. They are not a man-based team. They may have 3-4 principles, but they're not running Saban's, Ripla's match scheme on the back end or, cover 6, cover 7. They're running fire zone blitz schemes, and it's designed to disguise your coverage, drop into coverage. You can rob the RPO when you do that because you're, dropping. People see those ends and edge players dropping, and they complain about it. But what that does is they're falling in the lines for the RPO slants. And teams can't, if you do that on any sort of regular basis, teams can't run the RPO slant or it's a turnover magnet. And so it kind of blows up that style of play. Notre Dame, to your point, doesn't really want to play that game anyway. They want to be, old school power run football with a stable, maybe, I'll go so far as to say, really maybe the best stable of backs in the country. I am insanely high in Love. I think you are too, Daniel.
Yeah,
those guys are just massively underrated because they're quote unquote boring. I think they're better than Penn State's. I think Penn State's backs are really good. I think Ohio State has an argument with Henderson and Judkins, but I actually think Notre Dame's backfield's probably more balanced. But the positive is also a negative with Notre Dame, that while that is kind of what they want to be from an identity standpoint, they're not as good throwing the ball downfield, just flat out. They do run RPO when they try to make it work, and that might actually get blown up by the style of defense. So you really need to be successful running the ball. And again, with Georgia, nobody's run it. When you really look at Georgia overall, they've had a couple games where the run defense let them down. I mean, they gave up 5.
Well, quarterbacks are running.
That's the point. they haven't really, 3 games they give up 4 yards a carry, I think, this season. Maybe 3.5. Auburn was right at that line. I don't know. I think all this points to the fact that it's a low scoring game. And Daniel, with that, I'm going to go ahead and get in the model before we get to vamping too much. The model tends to agree with this. Again, the over-under is 44. Point and a half Georgia's favor. The model flips that. Our model loves Notre Dame. Now, something we've seen, and I even, when I designed this model, we've run it for years. I used to do it by hand. We finally automated it so we could share it. I put a dadgum caveat on the model prediction to say teams playing very weak schedules are overvalued. I wouldn't say Notre Dame's schedule is very, very weak, but it is certainly rather weak relative to what Georgia faced. They're not in the same universe. They're just not. You can get mad in the comments. I don't care. They're not in the same universe. There is something to be said that the model, knowing that, the model is going to overvalue Notre Dame. And the way I would explain it is, if you're an efficient, high-functioning team, you will beat other teams of similar or slightly better or worse quality on a consistent basis because you out-execute them. When you start ramping up in difficulty level, the fact that you execute at a high level is negated by the talent differentiators between the various teams. That was 100% the case with Indiana, and a lot of Notre Dame fans probably took exception to your point about Louisville, USC being the best passing offenses. Indiana is a great passing offense on paper in terms of averages over the season. The problem is their line play is not good enough to hold up against high-level teams. We'd seen it against Ohio State, and it got confirmed against Notre Dame, against really the only 2 high-level defensive fronts they faced. And suddenly the fact that they are a very well executing, balanced offense with a lot of different weapons no longer mattered. And that's kind of the problem, is Notre Dame's played that kind of competition where their execution level and whatnot can carry the day, and they certainly run it well enough that gives them this huge sort of cushion. And now you got to play a game against a Georgia team that can really stop the run. And when you look at the actual numbers here, yards per play, 5.5 to 4.8 is pretty anemic. Yards per attempt are predicted to be 6.4 to 5.7. We consider 7.5 to be a competent passing attack. So neither team expected to throw the ball well. The only difference is at 4.7 yards per carry, Notre Dame is expected to run it okay, and at 3.8, Georgia is not. Now, that's the model. Again, 22-17. This leads into another point. Maybe we could sort of segue into our predictions, Daniel. One thing we haven't talked about that I think is a major issue for Notre Dame, or a major factor in this game, is there's this guy called Trevor Etienne. Etienne was supposed to be the bell cow of this offense for Georgia. And at their heart, when they were playing Texas and they won that game, Etienne was carrying the load, but he's really not been healthy at any point this year. He missed the Clemson game, missed the Tennessee game, played a little bit against Texas. Looked the best he had all year. 5.88 yards per carry was the best average he'd had in any FBS game all season. 94 yards rushing was actually his season high on just 16 carries. He's going to be much healthier. And so I've given you this model, Daniel, and I've given an explanation. And again, I'm explaining why Notre Dame is probably overrated in the model, but I'm not saying that's overrated to the point where they can't possibly win this game. I'm saying based on Georgia, and bear in mind, our model doesn't know that Carson Beck's hurt. So this is really a model with a healthy Carson Beck. Notre Dame's probably not 5 points better than Georgia on paper with a healthy Carson Beck. Probably not. But how much do you counterbalance in all this? The scheduling factor, the fact that Georgia's going to have Etienne back. I know Frazier's been a good runner, but he's been a major fumbler, and he's still a freshman, and you can tell Etienne's a different caliber player. And Georgia also doesn't have Carson Beck. I mean, how do you factor all that in? And then from a prediction standpoint, maybe go ahead and tell me where you think that lands Georgia versus Notre Dame.
I think Notre Dame wins it. I'm picking Notre Dame. I know we're known on this channel for being Notre Dame haters, which could not be further from the truth. Some of the best numbers we've ever done have been with Notre Dame videos. So if we just wanted numbers, we would really just flatter Notre Dame constantly, which a lot of people do. Notre Dame fans don't hear a lot of tough love because a lot of analysts out there and a lot of people know it's a huge fan base and they get numbers. by just flattery. But this is one situation where not only do I think what I said before, that it's finally here that Notre Dame is on this echelon, like they're playing in a game and they belong in the game. 2012 Notre Dame didn't belong in that game. Some of the Notre Dame playoff teams, like, they didn't belong in the game. This Notre Dame team belongs in this game. And I think there are teams in this round that would beat Notre Dame by 10 plus points. I think the matchups, like I said before, Notre Dame is facing the offense they want to face. Even with the question marks of not having a lot of tape on Gunnar Stockton, they're going to get a lot of the offense that they want to face. And Georgia is not facing the offense that they want to face. And those two things combined, I think, give Notre Dame the win. If I were Georgia, even though he didn't show it against Texas, I would do what in the rematch of the 2011 in the national championship game, Alabama and LSU in the first match, I think it was like 9-6 in overtime or something ridiculous like that. And they just ran the ball. Both teams ran the ball. Hard-nosed running teams. In that national championship game, LSU brought the same offense that they had in that first game. They brought the same offense. Alabama came out throwing it all around the yard, and it shocked them. If I were Georgia, that's what I would do. And I would live or die with what result came out of that. But I think that's not what's going to happen. I think it's going to be kind of a feel-out kind of game. And I just think the matchups are in Notre Dame's favor. And I think their running game is better than Georgia's. For all of the ETN hype, and maybe it is because he's hurt, I was never blown away by him at Florida. And he hasn't really done anything to blow my mind this year at Georgia, even with the injuries. Give me Notre Dame 20. Give me Notre Dame 24, Georgia 20. What do you got?
I do have it kind of reversed. I'm actually just going to take the reverse score: Georgia 24, Notre Dame 20. I do agree. I think Notre Dame is in a position where they really can and should show they belong. I think this is a good matchup for Notre Dame. I think ultimately, to me, Daniel, the point is I think Georgia has more weapons. Notre Dame does not have a 500-yard receiver, which is a crazy statistic. I do not like teams that are this dependent on the run in high-level games against good competition with time to prepare. It rarely turns out very well. Unless you're just really dominant running the ball. It's hard to score a lot of points against a high-level defense operating like that. I do think there's the potential with Georgia to run on them. They've shown they've been susceptible to it a little bit through the year, but it's been too off and on. And when they've been focused, again, Tennessee game. Tennessee's a phenomenal run team. People laugh at that, but Samson got that Samson injury. I mean, he was the offensive player of the year in the SEC. That crippled him. I mean, they've got a really good run game when he's healthy, and I don't think they win that game. They play a bunch with him or without him, but they would have looked a lot more competent offensively. But Georgia shut them down. They made them look no different than Ohio State did, really, offensively. So I do think that Notre Dame's going to have a lot of problems moving the football. I think it's just going to come down to really whether or not they turn the ball over. And I got to say, I got to disagree with you. I think with Stockton being his first start, I think the smart play for Georgia is to assume that your defense is going to play at a high level and not put Stockton in a position where he's going to lose the game for you, because he almost did in the Texas game. I think really the strength of that Georgia team is really maybe still at tight end, as sad as that is to say. Bell was the guy that I thought really was the spark for that offense more than anybody, and he got hurt. Arian Smith is just too inconsistent. You can get some splash plays out of him, and I think to that point, you've got to use the run and use the underneath in a safe way, lean on your defense, and then what you want to hope for is one or two plays out of Smith, Lovett, or that receiving core that give you a 1 to 2 touchdown edge. And I think they have, as much as Notre Dame, yes, they have receivers, Georgia's just got a little bit better, I think. And I don't like Leonard in that look in that offense. But to your point, I mean, Leonard's a runner. Georgia's shown issues. Maybe I'm wrong. But that's where I land, is a narrow margin in Georgia's favor. But I do think it's close. And again, to your point, I mean, if Gunnar Stockton comes out and he throws as well as Beck does, Georgia could win by a large margin. Beck had looked terrible in first halves of away games, in particular, all year. He looked terrible in a lot of first halves, period, all year, bafflingly so. It may be that it's not as much a step back as we think, because Carson Beck, when he was on, was great. And I thought coming into the season, I thought on tape that he was the best quarterback in the country. I thought he was, when you did two things, Daniel, interesting stats I'll wrap up with here. From the end of last year, if you look at sack adjusted yardage, Carson Beck actually had the highest yard per attempt average in the SEC, sack adjusted. Jalen Milroe led the conference, but he was also last in sacks. Beck didn't take sacks. So he was actually averaging like 9 yards per attempt NFL stats, which is very different. And the opposite, the interesting thing to me is Florida was in the bottom half of the conference in rushing, but they took a ton of sacks. And if you adjust for that, they were like a top 5 run offense. And there's a lot of evidence when I went through that ATN actually probably was pretty undervalued, and that Florida run game was actually one of the most effective run games in the conference last year with ETN. So, I think there's some potential here for Georgia maybe to prove some things wrong. But I agree with you. I think Notre Dame belongs. I think it's a bad matchup, especially with a first-time quarterback. I agree with you. I think, just being honest, I think if Georgia had Beck and I knew what they were coming out with, I would have Georgia by a couple scores, like a 10-point advantage. And I will say with all that, Daniel, and it's a bit of a challenge, but it's the reality of the situation. I don't know if you agree with me. It is now or never for Notre Dame. This game, this matchup, these fronts, if you get pushed around, there is no excuse. This is not 2022 Georgia or 2021 Georgia. This is a Georgia team that you can handle, maybe not manhandle, but handle at the line of scrimmage. And if you are outclassed and athleted, I know you made the second round of the playoffs, but you will need to do a lot of soul searching. I don't think that's going to happen. And that's telling for why I don't think it's going to happen, but that is the reality of this matchup.
Yeah, I think if Georgia with a backup quarterback with like 10 career attempts falls into your lap in the playoffs, you got to win that game. You got to. In the second round of the playoffs, this isn't SMU. This is Notre Dame. You got to win that game. You just have to, because in any other year, you're going to have to beat a Georgia or an Alabama or an Ohio State to win a national championship. There's a high possibility that Georgia is the best team in the country by a pretty decent clip. They've beaten Texas twice now by a pretty decent clip, and this is the time you can beat them, maybe somewhat artificially because they don't have a quarterback. So you got to win that game. I agree with you. I think it's a great point. All right, y'all. Let us know what you think about this game, and give us a yardage total combined throwing and running for Gunnar Stockton in this game. I think that'll be an interesting talking point. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.